So what we're going to do next is to ask those questions. So the research question is still, what influences people's food choices? And we want to understand from people in this room what influences your food choices. So we're going to undertake an interview to pilot the interview schedule that you started to write before lunch. Now, don't worry if it's not complete. Don't worry if it's not exactly as you wanted it to be. 10 minutes is not enough to write an interview schedule. But I'm hoping that each of you will have 1 or 2 questions that you came up with that you would start the interview with. How would you start to explore this issue of people's food choices, why they choose what they do? So what we want you to do is get into pairs. You can spread out around the room. You can use whatever language you're comfortable with, depending on who you choose as your partner. Remember to listen to what your respondent is saying and follow up, as well as asking your own questions. So remember to try and follow the threads that emerge, as well as just sticking to your own questions. Listen for people's emotions, maybe, their own perceptions that maybe are different to yours. Listen to where people say don't know. That's as useful as where they say they do know something. And the interviewee, while you're answering, be as honest as you can, as honest as you feel comfortable with in the particular context. And think at the same time as you're answering, think about how well the questions are working. So what's easier to answer, what's harder to answer? What do you feel you can engage with? What do you not feel you can engage with? Because we're going to do 5 minutes of interviewing and then 2 minutes for the interviewee to feed back on the interview schedule. What did you think worked well? What did you think worked not so well? And then we're going to switch. So I'm going to give you 1 minute to get into pairs and find somewhere comfortable in this room. Then I'm going to indicate when your 5 minutes of interviewing starts. Then I'm going to indicate when that stops and your 2 minutes of feedback starts. And then I'm going to indicate for the next round. So 1 minute, please choose a partner, find somewhere comfortable, not the person you were writing the questions with. And then I'll indicate in a minute when you start the interviewing process. Okay, find a partner. So you will have one person asking and one person answering, okay? So you're not in groups anymore. You do not need to write down their answers because we will not be using those answers further. You can make notes if you like to remind yourself of things to follow up. The focus is on the process of questioning and answering and listening, okay? Okay. So 5 minutes, one person asks, the other answers. Then I will tell you to stop and reflect. Go. Okay, that's 5 minutes. Good. I hope you've had some practice. I heard lots of chatter, so that's good. Now, 2 minutes. Everybody, 2 minutes. The interviewee, please feed back on how the questioning was for you. Okay, good job. I hope that everybody got a bit of constructive feedback. We will be discussing this more after we finish the second interview. So please swap. The person who was responding now interview. You have 5 minutes to interview the other person. So go. Admirably, I was hearing some great conversations. I realized that 5 minutes is difficult to even get past the first question. All we wanted to do was give a taste of how this is. In the real world, 5 minutes is unrealistically short, but 4 hours is probably unrealistically long, just as much as we would all like these long, deep interviews. So I had a question from someone about the length of time of interviews. The average is probably around an hour in terms of how long people are willing to give you. So when you're designing your interview schedule, you should probably have in mind that you want to get to most of your key topics within about an hour. But that's not a limit. If people are willing to go for longer, if they have more they want to tell you, by all means. But, from practical sense in the real world, when you're planning these interviews and also when you're arranging them, you're writing to someone or to say, can I have an interview? Or you're meeting them in the field to say, can I speak to you? An hour really is probably the minimum that you would want to try and get some information out of them. So I realise that 5 minutes is very short, but given that, we would like to hear how that went, and we would like to have a bit of discussion about what people found difficult and easy around designing the questions and applying those questions. Does anyone want to give us a sense of how their interview went? Does anyone volunteer to tell us how they found that?
Actually, I was very polite respondent. So I respond very straightforward, and I never use emotions. And she had a control on his scheduled interview. She asked me what type of food, what types of food, what quantity of food I use in my home. And then she asked very good question that why you don't want to change, why you don't want to grow your own grains to eat. So it's a very nice one.
So she started off, as I heard it, with some, what do you eat? And that's to make you comfortable. But then she was asking why you do that. And those are the kind of questions that we're likely to get to in these qualitative interviews, to explore with you why. Any other experiences that people would like to share? Just one or two?
Very good advice I got, that I should have asked what preferred food he would like to have. If given the choice, like there is some preference, what food he would like to have. I didn't ask that. I didn't inquire about that what is your preferred food, given what you are eating. Yeah, so that's what he said, like my preference goes. I asked him, what would you prefer to have as your food habit? Change in food habit.
Okay.
So he said, I would like to go back to what my...
So this comes down to interpretation of the overall question. So we asked the research question, what influences food choice? Now, one thing that might influence food choice is your preferences, but there might be many other things that... So if you're asking such a question as, what do you prefer? That's one way to get to the question, but it depends on what your interest is. So there is no right or wrong, is what I'm trying to get to. It's not that you should have asked that, it's that that's one option for something you could have asked, depending on your focus. But what we like are the very open questions, the why questions, that don't close down responses to one assumption that you've made about what influences people's food choices. So yeah, that was useful feedback.
I got many responses, like why he is having the food what he is having. So he told me he cannot grow other food. Like I asked him, if you have land, then why you are not growing pulses when you are eating pulses? So he said, my soil is not good. So, climatic condition and soil quality. So it's not only the income. And
Sure.
then youth choices, like children's preference also.
So you had a lot of themes that came up from your open why question that, given more time, you would have explored. Yeah, fantastic. Okay.
When I was doing the interview of my interviewee, I focused on what influences his food choices. But then when I look at the question again, it actually says what influences people's food choices. So I figured I didn't ask the right question. Or is that okay? Because it's one thing to respond about myself. And if it's people's choices, then I will think about my neighbors and other people as
Sure.
well and stuff like that. So I just wondered, what was the idea behind the actual question?
That's a really
you gave
important
us?
distinction. Yeah, thank you. So the question here is the research question for the study. What influences people's food choices? Okay? The questions you will ask an individual in their interview is about their food choices. But then you'll ask another person about their food choices, and another person, until you're getting some patterns, as Lizzie said. Some patterns come up in the responses. And those patterns in the responses about these individual people's reasons for their food choices help you to answer the research question, what influences people's food choices more broadly? So this is a research question, and that is distinct from an interview question. Now, that's a quirk of the English language. There might be something in other languages that, the two are different. But in the English language, we have a research question, which is distinct from the individual interview questions that you will ask. And the responses to the interviews help you to answer the research question. So you interpreted it as I would have as well. So you're asking the individual about his experience, because that's what you're trying to understand. But then in the totality of the research, you have lots of people's experiences from your multiple interviews to draw on, to find patterns from, to answer the research question. So does that answer the distinction? Okay, we are about to move on to analysis. So if it's about how you find those patterns, we are about to do an exercise.
My interpretation goes like, what influences family choices? Because I imagine like this question would be for the community level, and when we go to community, like we will go to family and family members. So basically, I made a question related to what influences family choices.
Okay, and I think that's a valid interpretation. Remember, when you're conducting an interview, you can only get information from that person on what they think. So you can ask them perhaps about how they provide food, input into food choice for their family, absolutely, in the context of their family. But I'm not sure you can ask them to respond on behalf of anyone else, be that someone in their family or be that, people in general. So just be aware, and I think that's what we would say, that you're having a conversation with one person. You can't expect them to know what someone else thinks, feels, experiences. So by all means, ask them as a person within the context of their family or their household or even their community. But be aware that what they're answering is for themselves. So you can't necessarily extrapolate that their son or their grandmother would feel the same. So it's, by all means, place them in their context, but you are interviewing an individual.
Basically, when I make a question related to demography, economy, and family leadership, so family leadership is also going to matter what influences people's food choices.
So those are all factors that might do, but they're all quite closed, almost quantitative questions. You could get to each of those through a survey, or you could get to how people experience those things through an interview. In the interview, we're asking a sort of a more open question about people's experiences and perceptions. You've just listed 3 things that may well influence food choice, but what if they had 40 other things that influenced it that you had never thought of? You need to be open enough in your question that they can come back with their experiences, not prescribe that they must tell you about the things that you think are important. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Lizzie or Lauren, do you have anything to add? Because I think this is a really important everybody struggles with this, so I think it's important to clarify.
Well, I think what's interesting is in the questions, it appears that as people go forward with the research, nuances appear. They suddenly realise, there's more than one ways of interpreting a particular question. So in a sense, the process is iterative. You almost can't be entirely aware of all your interpretations until you've done the interview, and that brings up new issues and new questions, and you can then formulate new interview questions from your new interpretations. So in a sense, that really reflects the inductive process of data gathering that we began with at the beginning of the session.
Yeah, and I might just add as well, I think it's also you get better at interviewing with experience. We were talking about it being both an art and a science before. You don't, just as you need to develop skills in a laboratory, you also need to develop interviewing skills, and it takes practice. So probably when you first start, it's quite difficult to ask questions that are not on your pre-prepared page. So I don't know how many of you found it. How many of you found it quite difficult to ask anything that you hadn't already thought about and written, and how many of you were able to listen to what they were answering and think of something in the moment depending on what they responded. And that takes some practice. And I think, some of you may have struggled with that, and that's completely normal. That comes with practice. So, and that is also part of the sort of the difference between more quantitative and more qualitative. And I don't know if also, if any of you picked up on some of the nuances. For example, you're all from very different countries. I don't know if you found there was any problems at any point if you were speaking to someone with a different native language to you, and if you thought about how maybe that may have affected the interpretations of the answers and the questions. So these are also things to reflect on with this exercise that we just did.
Great. So we are going to have another session of sort of question, answer and feedback like this a little later on. So just to wrap up this particular piece, the interviewing piece, it's not easy. We all think that qualitative interviewing is going to be an easy thing because we all have conversations in our everyday life all the time, right? We know how to speak to people. The difference with a qualitative interview, as I said before, is that you're going in wanting to have a conversation and find out what the other person thinks, but with a schedule, with some goals. And it's that changes this from a normal conversation, and it's that which is a learned skill, as Lauren was saying. You don't expect that you will go in and do this perfectly first time. Qualitative research is just as difficult and just as rigorous, if done well, as any other research. So I hope that we've given a flavour of that. We will thank you for your feedback, and we will have more time for Q&A later. Now we're going to move on to look a little bit further at the analysis stage. So you've done your interview, you've got your transcripts. What happens next?
Okay, we're moving on now to looking at how qualitative data is analysed, and how, if you remember at the beginning, in the inductive process of reasoning, we identified patterns in our data from which we could generate a theory, an explanation of some observed phenomena. So in this session now, I'm going to be talking about how do we identify these patterns? What is the formal process for analysing, identifying themes, and generating theory? And here, what I'm going to be focusing on is coding. And coding, as I'm sure many of you already know, is the main method that we use for analysing qualitative data. Just imagine that you now have, your 50 interview scripts, you have newspaper articles on the topic that you're considering. That would also constitute data. You have your field notes, maybe your observations that you've written up from your participant observation. Many different types of qualitative data in script format, and now you're going to be sitting down with this data and analysing it, looking for themes that are cut across this data. And this is the process we call coding. Now, there are two types of coding, a bit like interview questions. We have open coding and then more focused coding. And it's somewhat similar to the process of knowledge collection in interviewing, because in our open coding phase, we are really we are keeping ourselves open to any possible themes or issues that arise, trying not to impose our predetermined categories on the data. So open coding is essentially, as I've said on the slide, reading your data line by line and identifying any ideas, themes, or issues that arise. And it doesn't matter at this stage how varied they are. There might be something significant that comes up repeatedly that isn't linked to your explicit research topic, but that seems very relevant to your informants. That kind of theme is very crucial, because that's the value of qualitative data, that it allows you to detect themes and categories that are relevant to your research participants that you may not have thought about previously. So in open coding, we're really keeping an open mind. We're looking for every and any theme arising in the data. Focus coding is usually something that we do after open coding. And here, the point here is that we already have established categories. We've got our themes and categories that we established during the open coding phase. And now, with our themes that we're interested in finding out more about, we now need to go back over our data, the same data, but it's a different process this time because we now have our themes in mind. So we read again, line by line analysis, and we look for more data on the themes that we've chosen, ignoring information that doesn't pertain to that theme. Because there might be a particular theme that comes up that because you weren't focusing on it in the open coding phase, you missed some data on. That's why we need the more focused stage of coding. While we're doing our coding, we generate what some people call theoretical memos. Now, this is the process where we begin to identify patterns. You'll notice that in open and focused coding, we're not identifying patterns, we're identifying themes and excerpts of data individually and separately. Now, to identify patterns, we need to generate theoretical memos, and these are like notes to self, okay? Here we're identifying and picking out and selecting categories that we notice re-emerge regularly. And here, in theoretical memos, we have the opportunity to make notes about connections that emerge in our minds. We note, perhaps, we're attentive to our own reactions. Is there some way in which we're judging what we're hearing? It's important to be attentive to our own reactions. There may be issues that are left unanswered in that interview script, and from there we can generate new questions for a new interview. This is why qualitative data is really quite specific in that the research process is informed by the data collection, and different researchers have different ways of going about this. Some people will collect lots of data. So I generally collect data for 3 or 4 weeks, and then after that period do some basic coding, which will generate new themes which I can then use to continue my research. So we often do this in stages. If you're involved in much shorter qualitative projects where you just have, say, 2 weeks to collect data, you probably you might not do that much coding as you're going along. You might leave that to the end. If you're doing a group-based rapid assessment, it can be important to code as you're going along because you're trying to triangulate with other researchers and their findings. So there's slightly different ways of going about this in terms of the stage. Now, once you've generated your theoretical memos and you've added to those and built them up and patterns have emerged and you've analysed a sufficient quantity of data, you may then be in the position to generate theoretical propositions. This is the final point. This is a statement that explains an aspect of social life that has been observed and recorded. Now, what you might be aware of is that in documents that predominantly rely on quantitative findings, what you tend to have is like the odd a quote from an informant that substantiates the findings scattered throughout. Now, of course, some of you might think, well, that quote is only from one person. That's not evidence that the general group of people interviewed think in the same way. Now, the purpose of evidence in a qualitative research paper is to be illustrative. When you're writing up a quote, it's illustrative of a general tendency. You can't present all your data, all your findings in the scope of a single, published paper. You select examples that are illustrative. So that's really the response to concerns about, what value a single quote has. It's illustrative. So here we have the data that we've collected, the concepts, themes, and categories that we identify during the coding stage, and finally the theory that we generate from that. Now, some of you have raised the questions about how do we generalize in qualitative methods? How do we make, if we're not using statistics, how can we generalize? How can we, say that one thing pertains across a broad region? Now, the clue to answering that, and it's really quite different from statistical reasoning, but generally we generalize from using theory. Now, theory, we only have one theory to explain a large body of data, but that theoretical explanation can then be used in different contexts, different villages, different areas. If we repeat the study several times and that study, the data generates a similar theory, then we have the basis to make more general statements. So whereas quantitative data generalizes using statistics, we tend to use theory. I know that for those of you in quantitative, using quantitative methods, you might have questions, queries. You might not find this particularly convincing. I'd be pretty amazed if I managed to persuade you all over to inductive reasoning today. And we're open to critical questions. But this is just to. But what I want you to do is to have a sense of the process. Okay, so there are some interview scripts coming round, and they're coming round now. And the next exercise, I'm going to give you 15 minutes to do this. I'm giving you a short interview transcript. It's not related to the previous exercise. This is an excerpt from an interview that I carried out in rural South Africa. It's with a 65-year-old farmer. And the research is trying to find out more about a government scheme which provided free potato seed. I'm not going to say much more than that, because what I want you to do is practice your open coding. We're not going to do focus coding here today because we don't have time. But what I would like you to do is carry out an open coding on this data. So what you'll do is read line by line. Don't worry if you don't get to the end of the script. It's important not to rush. I want you to read line by line and identify themes. You might feel kind of frustrated. Oh, I don't know enough about this research project to know what themes to look for. That's in a way the point, because you're looking for things that are relevant to the interviewee, not to yourself. For open coding, the things to remember, we're looking for identifying categories within the data. The categories, what we want to know is, what are the categories that aren't not ones that are relevant for me, but what is this interviewee, what categories is this interviewee using to explain his own experiences? What are the categories that he uses to explain his own experiences? Words, concepts, or explanations that the interviewee provides to account for what is happening. That's what you're looking for. You can see that I've left a margin on the left-hand side, so the process is to underline the relevant bit and then make a note corresponding, in the margin corresponding to that line. Avoid looking for your own preconceived concepts or hypotheses. I've already talked about that. Be attentive to the possible problems of translation. This interview script was translated from isiZulu. It was a Zulu carried out in Zulu, the interview. And so what you want to look for are issues that where you think, I'm not sure. Do you really, has that been translated accurately? That seems like a very subjective term. I wonder what that term means in Zulu. Maybe you'll come across a sentence that sounds quite awkward in English, and you might wonder, what are the cultural presuppositions underpinning that sentence. So you highlight things that don't quite make sense too. Now, finally, the questions. The questions are also data. This is really important in qualitative research. You are not outside of the data that you're collecting. You're part of it because your own interpretations influence the data. So the questions have to also be critically analysed. Are the questions suitable? Can you identify open and closed questions? Is there a question that was too closed, that it really unnecessarily imposed particular categories on the interviewee? So subject the questions to critical inquiry as well, and we'll also talk about what you think about the questions. I'm going to give you about 15 minutes. Does anyone have any questions just of clarification of what we're meant to be doing? Okay, so everyone understands the task. I'm going to be giving you about 15 minutes to do this task, and I'll be coming around if there are any questions. Go. So I hope that you found that coding exercise useful. I'm interested to hear your reflections on that. What kinds of issues came up for you as you were coding? What kinds of challenges or complications, if any? Would anyone like to feedback?
A very challenging issue for the farmers he faced. And the other is, I understand there is also gender issue, gender disparity. Most of the farmers are women farmers, but he is not in a position to consult with them. They are not happy to give advice for him. And the other, what I understand is there is a monocropping types. He doesn't diversify other alternatives to increase his income. He only produces the potato. And the other challenging issue is that labor issue. I think he's old enough, and there is a labor shortage by itself is a challenge, what we have seen. And the other is, as I understand, there is a water lodging issue, which may not be convenient for the potatoes production. This is the concepts I have understand.
Okay, so you picked up on a lot of themes there. I'm sure many people had similar kinds of themes. One thing you picked up on there, it was the question of labour shortage. And did anyone pick up on how labour issues were dealt with when there's a case of labour shortage? Did anyone pick up on that?
It sounds like the farmers actually team up to help each other, but one of his problems is the fact that because he's not on a very good relationship with his neighbors, he doesn't have that kind of help and only has his daughter to work with.
Yeah, exactly. So we can see from this transcript that one of the ways of dealing with potential labour shortage and of time constraint is by teaming up with neighbours. But we also, what we detect here that we wouldn't have picked up on a survey is the kind of interpersonal tensions arising from a project which is mainly, which caters predominantly to women, and the way that this particular individual perhaps feels excluded on those grounds, perhaps the centrality of kin and kinship, so various new questions arise. And here we might think, if we're thinking back to our process of induction, when we identify patterns and tentative hypotheses, we might tentatively hypothesize that people reduce the pressure of time constraint by helping one another. That could be the basis for a new round of interviews in an inductive process. I'm going to hear from you now.
So if I have to code this text, so I will start with first question is inequality in land distribution, and under then I will see what category of land size is available, because that is giving competition to the other. To him with others, and then the infrastructure is a big issue for me too. So one of the code will be infrastructure, where I will be having the transportation, market access, water logging, and then gender issue is also one of the code. Then profitability of the crop. So under that I will be having the different cost items and what price he is able to get. So what price will be also one of my code. Then labor and skill for the Yeah. Skill development and then local market also I have highlighted, and labor sharing.
All right, thanks. You've picked up on some really important themes there. Did anyone pick up on phrases that sounded awkward, perhaps sounded strange in translation, concepts that perhaps required further explanation? Yes?
Yeah, so one was, when he was talking about his daughter, he mentioned his daughter and then his kids also helping him, which I didn't understand the distinction between the eldest daughter and his kids.
Okay, so there again, the basis for further questioning emerging. Any other concepts that arose that?
I think when you come from a quantitative background, it's quite difficult to know, because you feel like you are walking on murky waters in some ways, and you don't really know exactly how to kind of interpret things, whether your view of things, where you come from, is actually influencing things.
Yeah, it's impossible to entirely escape the fact that we are bringing our own cultural presuppositions, our own academic knowledge to this material, and one just has to be aware of that. That's partly why we distinguish between open and focused coding, to try to avoid that. And you have to really approach the data without trying best to avoid those preconceptions. But you also have to have confidence, and what you'll find is that if themes are important, they will reappear through the course of the transcript. So that doesn't entirely answer the question, but I hope it does to some extent. I know we don't have long, do we? So I'll just point out a couple of things. Did anyone pick up on this idea of luck? Yeah? So you noticed him talking about luck. It came up 3 or 4 times. Now, that doesn't sound like a very social scientific concept, so you might have ignored it. But actually, this is a kind of kernel through which we might enter and discover more local truth. What does he mean by luck? What are the questions we can develop from this? What is the experience of contingency, of being lucky? What does that actually signify in this context? You might also have picked up this idea when he says that the other people don't know money. That sounds strange in English. So what does he actually mean? What is it to know money? That's an interpretive question. What is it in this context to know money? And how does knowing money or not knowing money affect your behavior and your understanding? So these are the kinds of little questions that arise from this material. I hope that exercise was useful for you to get a sense of how we begin to generate patterns. And the more the themes arise in your coding, the more confidently you can claim that those ideas are relevant. But your coding also gives you questions to ask in the next round of interviewing. That's the process of induction. Now, data analysis. Some of you might be thinking, why am I sitting here with a pencil and paper when there's probably some program out there that can do all of this for me? There is and there isn't, okay? So let me just briefly explain qualitative software. Most of us these days use a program called Envivo software for qualitative data analysis. And what this software helps you with is to organize your data. And it allows you to retrieve data easily through searches. It allows you to select and code. And it basically allows you to organize the stuff so that you can access it more easily. Of course, you can do searches for terms and so on. What it cannot do for you is analysis. It cannot analyze qualitative data. That's what you have to do. It can't code. It cannot even code. You have to go through and code. It can show you what words appear a lot, but you're the one who has to code and theme the data. It cannot generate theoretical memos. That work has to be done by you, and so it cannot theorize. Essentially, the analysis is really up to you, but what it does help you to do is to organize that data and to be able to retrieve it and file it in ways that make that data more accessible to you. So that's really the idea with NVivo software, and I'm happy to answer more on that if you like. So what we're going to do now is we've got 10 minutes left, and we want to kind of end with a general discussion of all that we've looked at and talked about. We've read your questions that you gave us at the very beginning, and we hope that we have addressed quite a lot of them, possibly not all.
I just have 2 points that I would like to make from what I've heard from walking around. So one is qualitative research is a process. Looking at one transcript or doing one interview will not give you the totality of the research that you need to answer your research question. It's the repetition of interviews, and it's the looking at multiple transcripts and interviews, or whatever your data happens to be, we've used interviews today, that will give you the patterns that you need to then formulate your ideas about what's going on in that context. So although in a 3-hour session that we've had today, we haven't been able to walk you through that entire process, I hope you've got enough of a sense of the process to know that you have to trust that process when you're doing qualitative research. And I promise you that as you do more interviews and as you look at more transcripts in your own research, those patterns do emerge. They do tell you what you need to know in order to create your theory. It's very difficult. I know some of you have done a lot of qualitative research, but for those of you who are new to this, it's very difficult to take that step and to trust that it will come out with something useful at the end. But I would say, trust the process. It's the multiple passes at the data that give you what you need, and it's a skill to learn. So you might choose to pursue it after today, and I hope that today will have given you the ideas of what you need to know more about. Or you may choose not to pursue it for yourself, but we also hope that the skills that you've learned today will help you engage more with your qualitative research colleagues and know how they are doing their research. So that's the first thing, just to trust the process. The second thing that we wanted to point out is about mixing quantitative and qualitative research. We had a lot of questions about how do we work with our colleagues who do quant and qual. And there are 2 things we wanted to say about that. So the first thing is make sure it's appropriate to your research question. You don't do qualitative research just because you can. You don't do quantitative research just because you can. You do what's relevant to answer your research question. So always think it through in context. And then the next thing is the easier way to think about it is to layer these approaches. So you do a qualitative study to understand what you might ask in your quantitative study, and then a qualitative study to follow up on the issues that raises. So that kind of layering approach is probably the easiest way to start to think about how to combine those in the kind of food systems research that we do. So I just wanted to make those 2 points, and then I think we're going to get some feedback from you guys. So what further questions do you have that might be useful for the room to hear? So not about your specific research, but that you've raised today, and what sort of issues have you found sort of useful that you didn't know before?
I had a question that, about focus groups. There was one of you had made a small comment about it along the way, and I wanted to ask a bit more. It was something about how you're interested not just in the information from the individuals within the focus group, but the interaction that's there. And if you could maybe explain a little bit more of what you gain that's more in that interaction than individuals. And tying that to a very early slide that you had about the power, being aware of the power relationships between researchers and participants and so on. But there's often power relationships among participants in a focus group as well that could also influence what you're hearing and how you manage or or use, work with that?
One of the values of qualitative research is that often the data is as much about what people either don't say or about what you observe them doing. And so one of the values of a focus group is that you can observe non-verbal, you can collect non-verbal data and very valuable non-verbal data, observing people's interactions. Is there disagreement on a particular topic? Does a particular topic create silence, and why? Have you stumbled upon a taboo? Are there things that people tell you in one-to-one sessions that they wouldn't want to mention as part of a group? So group dynamic and the non-verbal ways in which people communicate in that situation can be very, very important data. Alongside the practical issue of kind of you can interview quite a lot of people in 1 hour compared to just one. There's obviously practical reasons why you might do a focus group.
Actually, at the end of this exercise, if you would have given us the code, which actually should have been there, so we could have compared whether we are understanding or not.
Perhaps that's quite a good idea, so I'll do that for the next time.
Yeah. How do we code these emotions and non-verbal interactions you're talking of?
Yeah, so that's where your field notes come in. So, as Lizzie said, the transcript, the written, interview transcript is not your only piece of data. So when you're in the field, that's why I said in the interviews, as straight after the interview, you write down your thoughts and your impressions and your observations from that interview, because those will go into, they are also pieces of data. So, okay, so I've just been interviewing you in your office, and you've sat there the whole time looking like this, and you've just answered with one-word comments. You're not interested at all in what I'm saying. It's been a really difficult interview. Okay, pretend. After I come out, I will write down that was the situation. I will write down some of my impressions. Maybe there was one question that I asked and you just said, that is a useful piece of information. Maybe you've been asked that 100 times by 100 different NGOs who have come to do research. That's useful information. So I would make notes on all of those things. They would go as part of my data like a transcript. And then you've done all of your other interviews as well. And then when you come to look at your data, maybe 3 or 4 people responded badly to that particular question. So that tells you something. So that's... It can tell you about your way of questioning. Maybe I'm just questioning you really badly. But if everybody else responds okay, but you don't, then maybe it tells you something. So it's looking for those patterns, again, not just in the verbal, but in the non-verbal as well.
And I might just add as well, it can also help you to develop your data. So if you interview someone before you know them very well, and you get one set of questions, and as you gradually get to know people better, they start being more honest with you. You maybe know that first one, perhaps, they didn't feel as comfortable to tell you so much. So you may want to build on your relationship and go back to it, or at least acknowledge that.